So Vladimir Putin has outlined harsh and frankly ridiculous demands for Ukraine to basically surrender as a prerequisite for peace negotiations. These are being echoed pretty heavily on Western social media platforms by the pro-Russian crowd. All of this came from a speech Putin gave on June 14th at the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He once again insisted that Ukraine must recognize Russia's illegal annexation of territories in eastern and southern Ukraine and withdraw from these regions before Russia agrees to any ceasefire. Additionally, Putin demanded that Ukraine abandon its aspirations to join NATO, and for good measure, once again said that Ukraine must denazify, which is actually Putin's way of saying he wants the Ukrainian government replaced with one more friendly to the Kremlin. Putin's conditions would require Ukraine to surrender control of territory they currently controlled, including Kherson City, which Russia fled from 18 months ago. But Putin, in his benevolence, promised that Russian forces would immediately enforce a ceasefire and ensured the unhindered and safe withdrawal of Ukrainian forces. And he expects us to believe that, despite a history of Russian war crimes and violations of previous ceasefire agreements. Furthermore, Putin once again called for the international community to recognize the annexed territories as a part of Russia and lift all Western sanctions, which the West won't do because it undermines the core principles of state sovereignty and respecting international borders. But these demands are actually more of an information operation rather than actually truly something Putin expects to take place, because he made these demands just before the Global Peace Summit in Switzerland, and they are aimed at diverting attention and undermining the summit's purpose. President Zelensky responded saying that Putin's demands are always the same, which is to deny Ukraine's sovereignty. NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg echoed this sentiment, stating that it is Russia that must withdraw its forces from Ukrainian territory. What is really fascinating is, unlike previous iterations of Putin making these same demands, prominent Russian influencers are now criticizing Putin's demands as unrealistic. There is a realization setting in that Russia is likely unable to achieve any of Putin's stated demands, so him repeating them is futile. Despite denials from Russian officials to the contrary, the whole of the Western world continues to see through the Kremlin's interest in negotiating as a bad faith attempt and part of a broader strategy to elicit premature concessions from the West. The main reason is Putin also continues to saber rattle. He presents both threats and pleas for a ceasefire and thinks that they can coexist from one day to the next. In Putin's mind, they apparently can, and it is basically the strategy of a 10-year-old child that wants candy he can't have, which unfortunately partially succeeded in both the social media and conventional media spaces. You can tell by the headlines. Hell, I'm even talking about it. Now, according to the Ukrainian presidential office, the summit's purpose was actually to facilitate a multilateral dialogue to achieve a fair peace based on the United Nations Charter and international law. However, Putin's preemptive statements have managed to divert international attention to Russia's absence from the summit, and this is something the Kremlin is trying to amplify. Thankfully, we aren't blind to Putin's tactics, and several Western officials have acknowledged Russia's attempt to derail the purpose of the summit by focusing attention on Russia's absence. Ahead of the summit, the presidential office of Ukraine emphasized that Ukraine and its allies are prepared to present a joint peace plan to Russia at a subsequent summit should Russia choose to participate. Vice President Kamala Harris remarked that Putin's June 14th peace proposal was not an invitation for dialogue, but rather a demand that Ukraine surrender. Both the Germans and the Dutch have recognized that Russia should be involved in the peace process eventually, but pointed out that Putin is currently not interested in genuine negotiations with the release of his ridiculous peace proposals. Now, the Kremlin responded by saying the summit is unconstructive, and furthermore said that the West must address Putin's ultimatums if they genuinely seek peace in Ukraine and to, quote, save the world. Again, veiled nuclear threats rear its head because Russia is conventionally weak. Putin is basically using freshman-level statecraft by continuing to feign interest in negotiations during critical moments of Western decision-making. He does this every time NATO or the G7 meet, and he does it when there's a big vote in Congress to take place on Ukrainian aid. In reality, Western pressure to push Ukraine into negotiations with Russia before Russia abandons the war is not going to be any kind of lasting solution. Instead, what it's going to do is buy Putin additional time to further strengthen his military and lead to further aggression, which is exactly what Putin wants. It's all clearly Russian bad faith actions. And how do I know it's bad faith? Well, for one, Russia was discovered to have attempted to sabotage the peace summit in Switzerland through cyber attacks. The Swiss National Cybersecurity Center reported an increase in cyber attacks against several Swiss government websites and organizations involved in the summit. And a Russian hacker group admitted that they were doing it and said that they would conduct further attacks to disrupt the summit. Nonetheless, Putin's more frequent use of both pleas for a ceasefire and aggressive rhetoric is indicative of a leader that is running out of options for ending this war on terms that he sees as favorable. The good thing is, many in the West realize this too.